Welcome to Divine Couples. Your host, Naomi Slater, will awaken your passion, deepen your intimacy, and invite healing into your relationships, working towards accessing higher levels of consciousness in all areas of your life. Come with us on this journey to explore and experience your fullest potential.
So today we're going to be talking about expectations in relationships. Now, most people have expectations in relationships. This is very familiar to most people. Why is that? And the reason is really rooted in our childhood. So we were raised by parents that probably had expectations of us. And these expectations are oftentimes passed on to us. And then, of course, when we're in relationships, whether they be intimate relationships or friendships or with our siblings or any other kind of relationship, we often come into these relationships with expectations that we were essentially handed off to us through our parents. Now, there are different kinds of expectations. And I'd like to label these two different kinds. One, I like to call limiting belief expectations, and I'll define that in a minute. And the other is called core needs expectations. So, limiting belief expectations, what are those? Those are essentially expectations that are holding you back and not connected to your truth. Now, these are expectations that ultimately, if you want to work on yourself, these are expectations you would like to uncover and release. For example, so when I first met my husband and we were thinking about marrying, there was something about him that really, really bothered me, and it was his pace. So he has a much slower pace than I do. He speaks more slowly. His actions are slower. He gets ready more slowly. He's just kind of a slower person. He has a different pace than I do. And I was raised with a father that expected that everything be done immediately. Everything has to be done now. And as a result, my pace was different. I had expectations that his pace had to be like my pace. Now, of course, this expectation of mine is a limiting belief expectation. It doesn't serve, it didn't serve me and it didn't serve the relationship, but it was something that I had carried on through my childhood and was affecting my relationship. So this is something that I essentially had to work in the relationship. It wasn't his problem, that I expected him to have a different pace. It was essentially my problem. And it's part of this work is recognizing how our limiting beliefs harm us and our relationships. And if we are able to recognize them, we can really transform in amazing ways. So another example of a limiting expectation would be that, for example, a man or a husband expects that his wife needs to cook him dinner. This may be something that he saw his mother doing for his father. And, this pattern was ingrained in his mind. So this could create a limiting belief expectation in future relationships with partners. Does it have to be that way? Of course not. But this was the pattern that this particular person or man was raised with. Or, for example, another one would be the guy should always cover the tab. I kind of had this expectation in the beginning also when I met my husband. That was quickly thrown in the trash because that's just not his style. And I had to discern that the fact that he wasn't always covering the tab didn't mean that I couldn't be happy with him. It didn't mean that he wasn't the person that I was meant to spend my life with. So this was a limiting belief expectation that I had that I was luckily able to overcome. Okay, so those are some examples of limiting belief expectations. Now, what are core needs expectations? These are expectations that are connected to your deepest needs. These are expectations that ideally you would learn to identify and communicate them clearly to your partner or to anybody else that you're in a relationship with. So, examples of core needs expectations are honesty, physical safety and boundaries, freedom, just to name a few. So, these are expectations that you don't want to compromise on because they are very, very connected to you feeling satisfied and fulfilled in a relationship. So these are core needs expectations. You're not going to compromise on them, but you do need to learn to communicate them clearly and of course first identify them. You have to be able to tell the difference between what are limiting belief expectations, and those are expectations you would want to work on kind of debunking, and core needs expectations that you need to learn to identify that they really are a core need and that's something that you cannot compromise on. Okay. Now, if you have lots of limiting belief expectations, you're going to find that you're going to be very unhappy in your relationships. Not just relationships that are intimate, but really all relationships. You could find that you have all sorts of limiting belief expectations um, in relation to your parents. You know, you think that they should be doing this for you, they should be doing that for you, or your siblings, or anybody else you're in a relationship with. So if you have lots of these limiting belief expectations, you can accept to feel unhappy in your relationships because you're always focused on where the other partner is lacking, and you're constantly feeling that things are being done to you. Okay, so this does not mean that you should be able to have a fulfilling relationship with just anyone. What it means is that we need to do deep inner work to be able to understand the difference between limiting beliefs that are getting in our way of having fulfilling relationships and core needs that are in alignment with our soul that we shouldn't compromise on and should learn to communicate clearly. So, this leads me to communication. Communication is something that I'll be talking about lots and lots because it's such a core element of having a healthy, happy relationship. So, once you've learned to identify your core needs, you have to learn to communicate them effectively and clearly. And of course, also in a non-violent way, in a way that your partner can actually really hear them. So, part of that is learning to communicate our emotions because oftentimes our core needs are based on our emotions. And part of that, of course, is also learning to take responsibility for our emotions. Now, what happens when core needs aren't met? So, what happens when core needs aren't met, whether you're aware of what they are or not, what happens is you end up fighting about lots of silly things constantly. You might fight about, your partner not having changed the toilet paper roll. Silly things that aren't going to really determine whether or not you're happy in the relationship. But because your core needs aren't met, you end up fighting pretty much about everything. Now, imagine that you have a core need for feeling desired by your partner, and that need isn't being met. That's going to be a deep, festering sore for you because it's a core need. Now, because a core need isn't being met, every little thing they say and do will trigger you. Now, it's important to deeply understand what our core needs are, and this requires doing deep emotional work on our own. So, first, it's a matter of understanding yourself and understanding, like I said, to differentiate between limiting belief expectations and core needs expectations, and learning to differentiate between the two requires deep emotional work that you need to do on your own. So this essentially leads to understanding that in order to have a happy and healthy relationship, you want to come into the relationship being whole. You want to be a whole person. What does it mean to be a whole person? It means that you deeply understand yourself, you deeply understand your emotions and where they come from, and you're not, of course, blaming your emotional processes on your partner. So if you have lots of unprocessed emotions and you don't understand yourself, how can you be happy in a relationship with someone else? That's going to be very difficult to be happy in a relationship with someone else if you don't understand yourself. So your individual emotional process precedes having a healthy relationship. So you first have to understand yourself. Now, what happens when you do the work in a relationship? So when I say the work, what I mean is you're processing your emotions. You're really, really getting to know yourself in a very, very deep way. So one thing that could happen is you begin doing the work, you begin processing your emotions, and your partner isn't doing the work at all. They're not trying to meet you. They're just kind of staying stuck in where they are in blame and shame. And at a certain point, you realize that you're just not meant to be, that you don't want to be in this relationship anymore. You're transforming yourself. You're doing the work. You really want to change. You want to have a relationship where you feel happy and fulfilled, but your partner isn't meeting you there. And that's okay. So you realize that you weren't meant to be, and maybe you end the relationship. Now, another outcome, which, if you're already in a relationship, would be nice to have, but you're doing the work, you're in a partnership, and your past shit comes up, which is what happens when you start doing this emotional work. And that can sometimes lead to the relationship actually getting worse before it gets better. And this is to be expected and accepted. So when you start doing this work, you have to allow for perhaps emotions that you had been suppressing before. You have to be willing to allow these emotions to surface. And that can be very scary for a lot of people, because what it means is that you become way more vulnerable than maybe what you were used to being before. Now, when you start doing the work, of course, you learn to communicate your core needs. You start to recognize your core needs. And you begin working on recognizing, of course, your limiting beliefs and where they're not serving you or the relationship. Now, when both people start doing this work, like I said, first you're going to have to deal with some difficult emotions that you're going to have to process. Now, if you're not willing to face these emotions, they're just going to stay stuck. And that will create both physical, mental, spiritual issues for you. If you do allow them to surface and you do allow them to fully express themselves, those emotions will essentially be able to pass through you. So, and then, you will essentially be clearing those emotions out of your field. Now, when both people are doing the work, what happens is when you do argue, you're going to be arguing more about core issues as opposed to limiting beliefs, and, silly, quote unquote, silly things that aren't really going to determine whether or not you are happy in the relationship. So you're going to start arguing more about core issues, things that you cannot compromise on, because they determine really whether or not you are happy in a relationship. The silly stuff, it's not that you're never going to fight about it anymore or argue, but you'll be able to recognize it very quickly and